Namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India, at the Bank of Baroda Mughal tent. The festival brochure and flyer with details of the full program are available at the information center, but they're priced. We are delighted to introduce Lords of the Deccan. The session is presented by The Week. Anirudh Kanisetti's upcoming book, Lords of the Deccan, Southern India from the Chalukyas to the Cholas, is a testament to his thoughtful and immense study of medieval South India and its influence on contemporary politics and culture. He explores medieval political power, globalization, and the vibrant cultural patronage of the medieval South. Manu Pillai is the author of Rebel Sultans, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji, the Ivory Throne, Chronicles of the House of Travancore, and most recently, False Allies, India's Maharajahs in the Age of Ravi Varma. He has contributed extensively to the fascinating history of medieval Deccan, a different age that ended an empire and rewrote India's destiny. Both writers come together for an invigorating conversation on the lords and legacies of the Deccan. Anirudh is a history researcher and writer. His work has been featured in the Hindu, the New Indian Express, Live Mint, and the Print, among others. Manu is a critically acclaimed writer and historian. He formerly worked as the Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor and has won the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. Over to Anirudh and Manu.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. I saw that the word invigorating was used for our conversation. We'll have to judge based on the audience's response how invigorating the conversation is. But what was invigorating was the book, because it really is a splendid book. Those of you who haven't read it yet, it fills a major gap in the medieval period. As Anirudh says, we in our school textbooks generally move from the Guptas to the Delhi Sultanate and completely eclipse about 4 or 5 centuries where the drama and the action was really happening in the Deccan. Now we'll start with a very simple question. The book is titled Lords of the Deccan. Why did you take an interest in the Deccan? What is so important about the Deccan? And why are you making this very strong and compelling effort to center the Deccan in conversations around what we call Indian history?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you, Manu. And thank you to all of you for being here early on a Saturday morning. Is this better? You can hear me clearly. And thank you, of course, to the JLF and to William Dalrymple, who have supported this book and given me this magnificent platform to be speaking at. So to answer your question, Manu, I don't think a lot of us really reckon with the sheer size of the Deccan. Kerala, for example, has a coastline about the same length as the coastline of Portugal. And Kerala is a relatively small part of southern India as a whole. It's an enormous landmass. The Deccan is larger than France. It is about the same size as Germany. And just like France and Germany, it's had a revolutionary history. It's had the rising and falling of great empires. It's had poets and revolutionaries who challenged systems fundamentally and really written literature that has shaped and reshaped India for many, many centuries. And yet, when we think about the history of India, or at least the way that it's taught in schools, which kind of, I think, has continues to have a legacy on the way we think about history throughout our lives. We tend to focus only on North India's empires. And it's not really North India as a whole, but really the Gangetic Plains. And the Gangetic Plains are definitely a vast expanse, but they're still a tiny part of the subcontinent at large. If we were really to understand the history of the subcontinent as a whole, we must try to think about the way we think about European history. We can't think about the history of Europe without talking about the history of Germany, without talking about the history of France. Why is it that we talk about India without talking about the history of the Deccan?
And the Deccan is quite physically in the center, so it probably makes sense to include the Deccan. But you have this sentence about how we talk about golden ages and how the Gupta era is considered this great golden age. And you sort of argue that perhaps that title, if it must exist at all, golden age is always a very tricky term.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a very wise term to use, but if we are using it in popular discussion, it perhaps belongs to the Deccan. That's, in a sense, a provocative claim to make in today's world, because we're used to just the Guptas being that. Why do you call it this, like a claimant for the title of the golden age in Indian history?
So I very often get asked, I'm sure as a historian, you also get asked it a lot, is that if you were to go back in time, which king would you like to be friends with? Who do you like to have dinner with and all that? And my answer is always that I would not want to really meet any medieval Indian ruler. They were very intelligent, very sophisticated, very ruthless people. I'm sure within the space of about half an hour, I would have committed enough faux pas that they would have decided to have me trampled by their pet elephant. So in what sense is this really a golden age? Why is it that I think that this period deserves to be better remembered? Because quite frankly, so many of the things that we think of as so fundamentally Indian today, can you imagine India without temples? Can you imagine an India where Shiva and Vishnu are not the predominant gods? Can you imagine India where you don't have this thriving literary tradition, all these regional languages, or even India where this enormous body of Sanskrit literature doesn't exist? All of these are products of the medieval period. The Gupta period was important in terms of setting out some of these ideas, but these are all very tentative. They're still very much developing in the 5th and 6th centuries. It's really from the period from about 700 to 1200 when you begin to see this almost cascading series of like networks emerging and courts blossoming and knowledge kind of being exchanged across vast land masses. And it's almost like it snowballs, because as I started off studying the period roughly around 600, 700, I would see the remnants would be these relatively small temples or these very fledgling, stiff kind of works of art. But by the 1200s, you see enormous cities. You see vast temples. The sheer ambition and scale of these polities has totally transformed. And it's way, way more than what the Gupta Empire could even imagine. And it's happening across enormous landmass of India, especially in the Deccan. So if we were to call any period of Indian history a golden age, and if we were to really say that this is a period that if you want to understand India, we must study it properly, it would be the medieval period. And yet it features almost nowhere in our discussions of India's history.
Also, the political personality of the Deccan, that's the other point you make, which is that in general, the fixation with the North has led us to always look as, the North invades the South. There's always this process that begins in the North and then moves further into the peninsula. Whereas you show that multiple rulers of the Deccan actually did the opposite, which is that they were anchored in the Deccan, but often fanned out not just to the far south and the tip of India, but also very much into the north. The famous battle between Harsha and Pulakeshin II, for example.
And these are just examples from the period that I'm looking at, right? It's actually a much longer term historical trend because the Marathas invade North India repeatedly, especially in Kolkata, right?
We now have a Gujarati as prime minister, so I suppose there's something there as well.
So it seems to be, if you look at it from like a macro historical perspective across many centuries, I feel like it really depends on which part of South Asia tends to have a certain kind of political centralization, a certain kind of military and political culture that emerges. That really seems to determine which part is invading which part. Very often it tends to be North India that does it because North India has the Gangetic Plains. It's got an enormous population, and you very often have polities that want to expand and aggrandize themselves. The Deccan is equally large, but it's not as populous, but every now and then it seems to figure out these kind of military and cultural institutions that demand that it go and expand. And I personally find it very interesting when the Deccan invades North India because, as you said, it challenges the stereotype that we have, but it also on many occasions invades South India. And it actually very profoundly shapes the history of Southern India through its invasions. If you were to look at the geography of the Deccan, you'll see that it's bounded on the north by the Vindhya Mountains, right? And to the south, it's also got these hill ranges where modern Bangalore is that transition into the Tamil country. The average elevation of the hills to the south of the Deccan Plateau, the average elevation of Bangalore itself is higher than the Vindhya Mountains. So the Deccan is very much this area that's like, it consists of this grand river valley of the Godavari, which again is the third largest river valley in the Indian subcontinent.
So obviously it's going to have large populations, it's going to have cities, and it's got these mountains to its north and its south, and it's interested in projecting its power in both directions. To the medieval Deccan king, it was not about whether you invade North India or South India. It's about showing your military dominance in all directions. And as I talk in my book in a lot of detail, a lot of gory detail, this is something they accomplished with spectacular success on multiple occasions.
We'll come to the gore and the violence in due course, but since we are talking about political figures for now, who do you think, I mean, you've got quite a few of these political heroes of the medieval period, you know, Vishnuvardhana, Chalukya, Pulakeshin, who I mentioned earlier. Who to you is like one charismatic figure from Deccan history who really stands out? Pulakeshin's been talked a lot about because of his defeat, because of the defeat he inflicted on Harsha. But is there somebody else, like name one particular Deccan king, for example, and what was their career like? Where did it begin? Where did it end?
So the king that I personally find most interesting is this gentleman called Someshwara of the Kalyana Chalukyas. Now, all of us have heard of the Cholas.
What exact period?
This would be in the 11th century. So this is at a time when the Deccan has already seen empires for a few centuries. This guy is the ruler of an empire called the Chalukya Empire. It's based in North Karnataka. And all of us have heard, of course, of the Cholas, this powerful South Indian dynasty that's going and conquering Southeast Asia and so on. But it also invades the Deccan on multiple occasions. And as I show through primary sources that the Cholas themselves have left for us, these were often very, very violent invasions. We will come to that in more detail, of course, but the long story short is that multiple cities were burned, thousands of people were killed, many were assaulted, and Someshwara's entire career from the time he's crowned prince is spent fighting the Cholas. They're this world-ending threat that every few years is invading his kingdom, burning his cities, slaughtering his people, and repeatedly humiliating him. On multiple occasions, he sends ambassadors to speak with the Cholas, and what they do is that they garland the ambassadors with banners saying Someshwara is a despicable coward, and they have their heads badly shaved, and they send them back to Someshwara. Because, and you really have to think, like you have this world-ending threat that is coming to destroy your cities, that has this personal rivalry with you and your family, and you would understand if a king were to crumple in the face of such opposition. But Someshwara does not. On multiple occasions, he manages to, and at great cost to himself and to his family and to his people, manage to fight the Cholas off. And he does this in somewhat, morally gray ways. He betrays and backstabs quite a lot of people over his long and colorful career. And at the end of it all, it seems to come back to bite him. He actually, at the end of his career, his sons have decided to betray him. They're marrying Chola princesses. They're planning to overthrow him at some point. His closest ally has become a Chola vassal, and he's also struck with what his court poet calls a malignant fever. And he decides that he's had enough of existence and of life, and he goes and drowns himself in the full view of his court. You really have to think about the life this man led, the kind of tragedies and losses and successes that he would have seen over his career, and to finally end it like that. I keep imagining what it would have been for him to walk into that river that day, and what might have been going on in his mind, what he was thinking about. Was he thinking of his gods? Was he thinking of his sins? Or we'll never know. But yeah.
Mention of gods is interesting. I'll come to my next question based on that. But yes, power was such a fragile commodity in those days. You really had to struggle to hold on to it.
Yeah.
But you also talk not just about the political drama, but there's also a lot of drama in terms of religious identity formation. Temples are being built. The Jains are a huge influence. Buddhists not that much, but Jainism is really contending with Hinduism to dominate the South in this period. Again, something we don't necessarily imagine anymore. We have this pristine idea of our great Hindu civilization that's continued for a long time. And we forget that as recently as the medieval era, which is not even fully 1,000 years ago, it wasn't as though Hinduism was fully, in control in the South. Tell us a little bit about this religious diversity that exists there, the competition, the similar strategies that these competing religions are using, and how kingly patronage seems to sometimes tilt the balance between the two.
That's a very interesting question. I like the way you presented it as well, in the sense that, yes, we do think of Indian religions as this unchanging thing that has been the same for the last 5,000 years, right? And there's this, we are constantly talking about how innovative Europe is, and how, Europe had all these reformations and these, religious struggles and so on, while almost deliberately ignoring examples of India doing the exact same thing. And to me, at least, the reason why the medieval period is so interesting is because you see this constant churn. I talk about Jainism in a lot of in some detail in my book, not as much as I wanted to. But I'm sure quite a few of us have heard of the great site of Shravanabelagola near Karnataka. We have this enormous Jain monolith of Bahubali. And this was built by a general of a king who comes from a very, very violent dynasty. In fact, you'll find a cenotaph of a king of that dynasty in Shravanabelagola, which describes how he was so successful in battle that he would apparently carry a pyramid of the skulls of his enemies along with him wherever he went. Now, this may very well be poetic exaggeration. It might very well just to prove that the king was such a manly man who could kill so many people. But the fact of the matter is that it was not seen as a contradiction for you to be a violent aristocrat, to be successful in battle, and also to be a Jain, and to be commissioning great Jain temples and great Jain monuments. And that's because Jainism in South India was very profoundly acculturated to the way that Deccan operated. In South India, the Jain warrior aristocrat was presented as analogous to the Jinnah who conquers his senses. Just as the Jinnah conquers his senses, the warrior aristocrat conquers his enemies, which is such an interesting kind of way to present it, right?
Martialized Jainism.
Exactly. And even beyond that, right? I think the dominant religious trend of the medieval period is that all these religions emerge which promise to kings that if you perform such and such rituals, you will gain such and such powers, right? This is something we are fairly familiar with in Hinduism, but Buddhism also was doing the same thing in Bengal, and so was Jainism. And you even to the point where if you look at Jain sculptures that aren't of the Tirthankaras, you would have a hard time like setting them apart from like a Shaivite or a Vaishnavite sculpture, because they'll be the same kind of courtly aristocratic people, wearing these diaphanous silks and wearing these crowns and so on. And the Jain temples in South India also had processions, just as Shaivite temples do. There's this.
In fact, didn't Hinduism actually borrow from the Jains many of these aspects,
Yes.
processions and so on?
And Jains even had this idea of, and of course they still have it today, but there's so many commonalities in the way that they approach worship, right? The ablution that they do for the Tirthankaras, that's something that we have records of them doing alongside, Shaivites are doing it and so are Jains. So religiosity at the time was very fluid. We think of all these religious traditions as having these very strict boundaries between them today, right? Like, okay, this practice is Hindu, this practice is Buddhist, this practice is Jain. But that wasn't the way that like medieval people thought about it. We have many instances of a king, patronizing, a Jain deity and also patronizing Shiva. And it's difficult to say what the king actually believed in. Was this a deliberate political strategy? Or was it the case that the king believed in all these gods and wanted to spread his patronage as widely as possible? Another like intriguing possibilities that I've come across, and like I need to research it further, is that I think that that kings would deliberately educate their children in different religious institutions. Like they would have a preceptor who was rising up and was likely to succeed the existing preceptor of a matha across. So you'd have one kid who's educated as a Jain, one kid who's educated as a Shaivite, and in a different sect, and one in another sect, and so on. And then eventually, when the time came for royal succession, you would have these religious sects as well as the factions within the court, and of course the queens, all participating in deciding who succeeds. And of course, the king who comes to power does the same thing with future generations. So there's this very deep and eclectic kind of religious cosmopolitan atmosphere that's created by royals, perhaps as a deliberate policy.
I think it also challenges our idea and our conceptual idea of religion itself.
Yeah.
We in today's world believe that if you belong to one religion, you are therefore naturally excluded from other religions. Whereas the sense I got reading your book was that perhaps the way religion operated in India at that time was different, where you didn't necessarily need to confine yourself to one religion. In different contexts, you could actually end up supporting different religions. You may bring Brahmins on because, in a certain area, you want to extend the power of your state.
Exactly.
Agriculture, new institutions. Elsewhere, you may go and support Jains because they're already dominant there, and the
Right.
local people expect, you to sort of ally with them. But you also mentioned the queens, and that's the other, thing in the book. Although before we come to the queens, since we're talking about religion, forget the religion, but religion also enables these kings to construct their political self-image. You have this wonderful bit about the Chalukyas, about how they're essentially descended from crow bear wielding crowbar wielding hillmen, and that's their ancestry. It's a pretty obscure, ordinary kind of background. But then as they transition to kingship, suddenly this grand genealogy is constructed. Suddenly there are mythological heroes in the family tree, things that kings continue to do till the 18th century in India. Clearly, it's a template that was developed in the medieval period. And they say that, oh, actually the word Chalukya does not come from, what's the term?
Chalke.
Which is the crowbar, but from a pot. Of Ganga water and so on. The religion is also helping kings come into their own. Right.
So, I mean, this again is an aspect of Indian religion that I find so fascinating, right? Is that we somehow think today that when a king was being religious or doing or performing religious activities, that he was doing it because he was devout or because he wanted to leave some kind of legacy for people 1,000 years later. Oh, I was so devout. You must also be equally devout. But the reality of that is that, kings were politicians, medieval kings were politicians, and they wanted to consolidate political power using all means available to them. Sometimes consolidating power meant getting a whole bunch of war elephants. Sometimes consolidating power meant developing political charisma. And there were many, many ways that they would do this. They would do this, for example, by inviting poets to their courts who would be sitting and composing poetry, which would describe their lineage and their achievements in all these over the top ways. And very often as you said, Manu, this lineage was connected to the gods because it was a way for you to claim that you were elevated above the people that you're ruling over. And the Chalukyas are a particularly interesting case study because we know that they came from a relatively lowly background. And when you come from such a background and you aren't actually that different, genealogically speaking, from the people that you're ruling over, you must find some creative way of justifying your power over them, right? And claiming to be descended from the gods is a great way to do it. But what I find especially fascinating is that even though you can get in the minds of the first generation of Chalukya kings, obviously they know very well that their grandfather was not Brahma, but they're claiming it anyway. But their great grandson might actually believe it. They might actually think that, yes, I come from this endless line stretching back thousands of generations to the sun and the moon, and I have a duty that the gods have given me by virtue of my descent to order the world, and I must rule over it justly. And this is what I find so fascinating, is that we think that we know how medieval people thought. But can you actually imagine thinking that you're the descendant of a god and it is your right to go to war in order to order it the way that you see fit? It's so interesting, and also to me a little terrifying to think of how different these people actually were from us, and that we're still so convinced that we know exactly who they were, and then they want to teach us these modern lessons about nationalism. The world was totally different and fascinating.
What is perhaps, what does have a parallel even with the present day is the role of the women. And you see this era Mukoti with the Mughal women, for example. Often, even in your book, the women, you find that they are often constrained within spaces that are defined by gender, mother, wife, daughter, that kind of space. And yet they do have political personality. I'm guessing that because of the sources you are dealing with for the medieval period, this is probably slender. Anything to do with women is perhaps slender material. Even so, they do sort of make appearances, even so they do appear like they have political power. They're able to wield influence. They're able to, you have this case of, I think, Mangalesha's mother, who basically urges him to attack her own family, her own ancestral home, because political interests. And it reminded me of this Deccan queen who much later in the medieval period, in the Adil Shahi Sultanate, who blinds her own grandson because he's not up to the mark, discards him and gets an illegitimate grandson in his place because he's better for power. So these women clearly were important and they had political personalities. How did you manage to tease out the little bit that you were able to find?
So, one way to actually think about it is that we know from later periods that women were very, very active politically. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of music playing. Can you just pause that to be organized? We know from later periods, we know from Mughal history and of course from later Deccan history that women were extremely politically active. We know that they had their own ambitions. Very often they had their own resources because they came from aristocratic households. So it's quite possible, given the way that the political structure of the early medieval period was, that something very similar was happening, right? And once you actually move your perspective to thinking that, okay, women must have been active, where do I find them? It becomes easier to kind of see those hints in the historical record. Because these women are not hiding themselves. They in fact love advertising that they have power. But the way that nationalist historians in the 20th century interpret them was very different. If you were to read Nilakanta Shastri's History of South India, which I'm sure a lot of us here have, you'll see that the first section is racy political history where the men are doing amazing things and fighting battles and building temples. And the second half of the book will be about society and culture. In the society section, there'll be one page about women. And in that, there'll be 2 or 3 lines saying that, oh, this queen issued inscriptions, therefore we can conclude that women are equal in the medieval period, right? Which is a very bold assumption to make from very, very limited evidence. But once you actually go back, the picture that emerges way more fascinating is that this is a society where kings are misogynistic. Kings see themselves as being more powerful if they are able to conquer their enemy and seize their women. You'll have them boasting about seizing women on the battlefield and of committing all kinds of atrocities against them. And it's not seen as a contradiction in terms. You can be a just king because you are doing all this to the enemy's women, not to your own vassals' women, right? So this is a world where women are disadvantaged, but it is also an unequal world where there are some women who come from privilege and who are able to use that privilege and translate that into power. And within these courts, you got to think, you know, when you have a woman who comes from a royal dynasty herself, she's got her own resources, her brothers and fathers are probably vassals of the king, they're also in and out of the court. She's probably going to like use those connections to actually advance her own interests. And very often having a son was part of that interest. So it's important to think of these women as mothers, as wives, but also as people with ambitions and also with personal failings. I had this very surreal moment when I was looking at this old cover of Life magazine, which showed a Sumerian queen, like from a totally different time and place, ancient Mesopotamia. And it was a painting of her plucking her eyebrows while a handmaiden was standing behind her, like helping her with a mirror or something. And I was like, I suddenly had this eureka moment. I was like, this queen I'm writing about, who's making this temple and like claiming that she's upholding dharma and being so incredible and so on, how did she treat her handmaidens? Was she nice to them? Did she ever have fights with them? Did she have tantrums? There's some hints. I think there's some examples of Kota paintings, again, a very different time and place, where a princess is shown actually thrashing her maid in the inner courtyards. And were these fundamentally different people? They were governed by the same fundamental human impulses. So it's very possible that they were as equally like morally complex and layered. So they were ambitious, they were powerful, they were ruthless, they were creative, they were working in a man's world, but they're also still fundamentally people, the same inclination to using power in sometimes messed up ways.
In fact, the idea of power as some kind of masculine quality, I think, comes across in Rudrama Devi, the famous story that she used to dress in men's clothes.
Yes.
Because she was queen regnant. She wasn't somebody's wife. She inherited power as a daughter, which is unusual. And in order to hold on to that power, she essentially had to make herself a masculine figure,
right.
Physically, in appearance and so on. So it's interesting. But that brings me to the violence that you were describing. You know, there's plenty of instances in your book. There's a lot of rampaging elephants, people's mustaches being torn out, and people being dragged through the streets, and excrement being thrown at them, and women being raped and carried off, and so on, and people boasting about how many women they've carried off, and so on. Violence obviously was the other side of the coin as far as power was concerned. And this was, we can see this happening till the 19th century when the British were blowing people out of cannons and so on. Talk a little bit about this violence. And, you briefly touched upon how, kings said, okay, look, you're not from my kingdom, so I'm able to sort of come here and commit all these depredations. But violence is also very much about demonstrating power. And that's something that comes across in the book as well.
I personally find royal eulogies to be absolutely fascinating source material, because it tells you so much about like how and why a king is trying to present himself in a particular way. And the image that comes across is that to portray yourself as having this almost godly, divine, rampaging military power that you're projecting against your enemies, destroying cities, killing thousands on battlefields with like a single whisk of your sword. There's a really fascinating inscription that I came across. It's from the Hoysala dynasty, who are based in South Karnataka, and it's a rhetorical question. The poet asks, "Why does the south wind not blow?" And then he explains, it's because the south wind has been blocked by flowing into the nostrils of the piles and piles of skulls of the enemies that the king has left behind on his expeditions in this Kaveri River Valley, right? And all these colorful descriptions. I mean, it's very obvious the king may not have actually made such vast pyramids of skulls, but
I'm sorry, that reminds me of this other inscription you have, which is a taunt, where it basically says, Narasimha Varman, who wrote the syllables of the word victory on Pulakeshin's fleeing back. They're taunting each other in
Yes,
the
exactly,
inscriptions as well.
exactly. So you get all these hints of personality, and like the way they're thinking about it's all tied into their perception of masculinity. It's tied into their perception of divinity, and of course being able to give violence and also to hold back violence was very important to ideas of kingship. So you'll have this king saying, oh, this, that, I could like chop off so many skulls, and my elephants have torn apart this river and destroyed this city. But when my enemy surrendered to me, I was merciful to them, right? So violence is a very integral part of their worldview. To be a manly, powerful man who could fight battles. And it was very important for a king to be physically fit, or to appear to be physically fit, at least in inscriptions. We have no idea what these guys actually look like in person. So it's all tied together. You know, the prowess of the body, the prowess of the mind, the prowess of on the battlefield, and prowess sexually as well. All of these are intertwined into creating this image of the king as essentially a god on earth, who can be restrained by nothing except his own yogic powers that he like gains from like religion and so on. So as you can see, it's all intertwined, and like it's all projected and presented in all these different ways.
And that continues even into the Nayaka period. Sanjay Subramaniam's work, there's this whole thing about how Nayaka poetry talks about the virility of the king, and
yes,
the dozens and hundreds of women he's making love to, as if it's just an easy walk in the park. You know, for him, that's strong and that virile. Let's now talk about geography, because we're running out of time. A great deal of the Deccan's influence also comes from its location and access to the sea.
Right.
Parts of the Deccan were fertile, but a large section of that landmass was not necessarily the most fertile land in India. But trade, therefore, was naturally a very important thing. Yashaswini Chandra talks about the trade in horses. Gemstones are moving around, all kinds of goods and materials being exchanged. Tell us a little bit about how mercantile culture, trade, and that maritime space perhaps affected the evolution of these kingdoms in the Deccan.
So the Deccan's influence on India's commercial culture, I think, is like totally, like, it's so unknown, but it's so deep and so profound. Possibly the longest lasting commercial organization in human history, the Ainuravar, or the 500 Lords of Ayavale, which is a merchant organization that originates in North Karnataka and lasts for nearly 900 years. We have inscriptions of them going all the way from the 8th century to the 16th century, I think. And these guys, they start off in the Deccan, and then they later like transition to the Tamil country in the Southeast Asia trade, but they're also active on the West Coast as well. On the West Coast, because you have the monsoons basically acting as this kind of tremendous engine that like every year will move goods from one side of the Indian Ocean to the other and back again. People use it as a conveyor belt for many, many centuries in a way. And it moves not just goods, but also people. We have to keep in mind that there's a time when you couldn't just hop on a ship and it'll take you directly to where you want to go. You have to wait for the season. It has to be the wind has to be just right. The tides have to be just right. So you have to stay and put down roots wherever you want to do business. So we have examples of many, many merchant communities started by Arabs and Parsis along the West Coast. And these are cultivated by the Deccan emperors. There's this really fascinating example I talk about in my book of a Persian gentleman called Madhumati, the son of Sahi-Arahara, which is actually a Sanskrit title for Muhammad, the son of Shahryar. And this guy is a Persian. He's ruling over a Deccan port, and he's actually, the members of the town council are Hindus who are all friends of his. He sets up a temple to Durga, and he sets up a land grant, so Naivedyas offered to the goddess. And he's also got Parsis that he's ruling over. This is less than 100 years after the Arabs had conquered Persia, and the Parsis had fled from Persia into the Deccan. And here, less than 100 years later, in this very cosmopolitan Indian Ocean world, a Persian Muslim is ruling over them under the aegis of Kannada-speaking kings. Such a multicultural world that these people are a part of. You have examples of Jews and Muslims of various ethnicities settling down, marrying Indian women. And we have to think also these Indian women probably came from mercantile backgrounds. So you probably have these links that are being formed between Indian merchant guilds and foreign merchant guilds. And there's these connections from coastal merchant organizations to inland organizations as well. And you really see this deepening of commercial networks, of financial networks over the course of many, many centuries. And all of these are things that later influence the period that you write about, Manu. Because the Deccan Sultanates don't emerge onto a vacuum. They emerge onto a land that has seen commerce, that has seen royalty for many, many centuries. And they portray themselves very much as inheritors of that legacy.
wasn't there a dynasty also descended from merchants? One of these royal dynasties has merchant ancestors.
That's
no?
Harshas in North India.
Oh, in
But
North
yes.
India, yes, not in the Deccan. Okay. Okay, one final question before we open to the audience.
Sure.
Your process, this is just about the process of putting this book together. The medieval period, as I hinted earlier also, the sources are comparatively fewer. For example, compared to the Mughals who only went down in the 1850s, we don't have enough on Vijayanagara. Compared to Vijayanagara, we don't have enough when it comes to the Kakatiyas and the various dynasties that were there in the Deccan before. How did you go about finding your material? How did you go about interpreting this material? And for other interested people, what exactly are we looking at when you talk about material on the Deccan in the medieval period? What are your primary sources?
So the single most important primary source is these land grants, these royal eulogies that I was telling you about. And again, as you may have kind of guessed from the course of the discussion, you cannot take these claims literally. You cannot literally believe that the king was, with a whisk of his sword, was beheading thousands of people at a single time. But trying to understand the motivations and the culture that have led them to write in this particular way offers you a lot more insight into how these people operated, and makes it a little easier to kind of smell bullshit, to put it politely. It's a time when these people are over the top, just like we today, just like modern politicians. They're not interested in presenting a factual account of history. And so we have to read them with the same kind of critical approach that we would read modern political advertisements with, right? In addition to that, you also have enormous bodies of literature that was composed. A lot of this has actually been digitized. Critical editions are available on archive.org. A lot of these land grants are available on archive.org, like translated by the British, oddly enough. And they're just waiting to be read and rediscovered for you can just go there right now. It's totally free. And secondary research that definitely helps. Scholars in the US and the UK have done incredible work in terms of critically understanding. A lot of Indian scholars as well, like Manu Devadevan, for example. So reading the secondary research, figuring out how to interpret the primary sources, digging them all up, organizing them, and actually delving deep into them, with, of course, a heavy pinch of salt and an eye for how do the systems that we are familiar with really emerge? Instead of thinking of history as this kind of disconnected time which wasn't relevant to our own present, trying to see the echoes of the past in the way that we live today, right down to the inequality and the injustice and the moral complexity of it, is really the way that I approach the source material.
But as a quick follow-up, do you get enough on the lives of, let's say, common people in this period in the inscriptional evidence, or is it you read between the lines?
You have to read between the lines. And what you read between the lines is that they didn't have very pleasant lives, because your city was constantly at risk of being burned to ashes. and your farm could easily have been confiscated, given off to some Brahmin landlord. But we have to keep an eye open to the fact that these people also existed. And archaeology, I think, is really the way that we are going to find out about their lives. Unfortunately, there hasn't been enough archaeology done, but hopefully at some point we will get to that.
Thank you, Anirudh. We've got 8 minutes. So if there are any audience questions, I see several hands going up. Is there a mic to go around? Maybe we can start here.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Hello, I am Mahesh Naik. As the present Deccan is divided into linguistic various states, and in those states, which is a major language used, and how they make the balance between the languages, as we are finding it difficult today, what is about views on it?
So the Deccan basically consists of 3 major zones. You have the Marathi zone up north, you have the Kannada zone in the south, and you have the Telugu zone to the east, right? So in the medieval Deccan, it was a sign of sophistication for you to be able to be as cosmopolitan as possible. The more languages you could compose good poetry in, the more sophisticated you were held to be. But even within that culture, there are layers in terms of the prestige that a language has. When you start off in the 7th century, it's very much all about Sanskrit. But by the 8th century, the 9th century, sorry, Kannada begins to emerge as a new kind of courtly language. Towards the end of the medieval Deccan period, roughly around the 13th century or so, Marathi and Telugu also begin to develop their own kind of literary cultures. So it's not I can't give you a single consistent answer, because it changes drastically over time and place. But I think remembering that multilingualism was encouraged, and also remembering that even within multilingualism as a hierarchy, is really a better way to kind of remember and understand these language dynamics. Thank you.
I think we'll take a question from the back.
Hi, Manu.
Hi, Vijay. Hi.
Great work done by the both of you. I just wanted to ask you, and you start the book from Verul, Ellora, of course, the sites of Vatapi, Do you think the kings built these to leave a lasting legacy, like how the South Indian rulers left it? And I would take you up on the lands being confiscated to given to Brahmins, because our understanding of Brahmadeyams as they were was not confiscated land, but seed capital for the village. So have you seen any evidences actually of land being confiscated and given to Brahmin overlords or Brahmadeyams as they were meant to be, as places where Vedic knowledge was started off as seed capital? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. And again, it's not a consistent thing over time and place. And you have to read the literary sources in conjunction with archaeology, right? A lot of what we think we know about the medieval period is based only on reading the existing literary sources quite literally. We're like, okay, king says this, therefore it must have been the case. Now, if you were to look at there's some archaeology about the Vakatakas in the northern Deccan, and what it has increasingly revealed is the Vakatakas, when they're giving land to a Brahmin, are not giving a totally new untamed land to them to set it up. They're giving land that was already a village, where there was already a settlement before, and they're now redistributing it among a Brahmin sect in a new way. So it's partially about like creating, as you said, seed capital, where you want to have this hub of religious knowledge that will be useful to your kingdom later on. But it's also the fact that, yes, you're also changing the social relations in a way that's going to be useful to you. These are not wild lands. These are not virgin lands. These are lands where people exist, and their position in the social hierarchy is changing. I don't think we can say with any degree of certainty that it was always being confiscated, or that it was always being given only out of generosity just to inculcate knowledge. It's a very vast and very morally gray kind of spectrum. We have examples in inscriptions where villages are being attacked for not paying taxes. Children are being attacked. Women are being assaulted. So this is not a peaceful time. Tax is not being paid voluntarily. It's never been paid voluntarily, as I'm sure a lot of us can say today. So thanks for that question, Vijay.
There was a lady raising her hand there. We'll leave it to her now.
Hello, I'm Vibhavi Hada. My question is, as you mentioned that it was just for the kings to kill the people on the battlefield as they did not belong to their kingdom. So is it similar to the scenario in the political wars today? What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this tendency of us versus them, and saying that we will not commit violence against the in-group and we will always protect the in-group from the outsiders, we will always protect the in-group from the outsiders, has been a pretty fundamental aspect of like political ideology from the beginning and inception of human civilization. It's no different from what we do today. Define the other as somehow less human, or provide justification for treating them as less human. The more you learn about the medieval period, the more you learn that there are some things in human nature that just don't change, no matter how much our material and technological circumstances change.
We'll take one more question from there, and then from the gentleman in the front.
Thank you so much for both of your works and making it so interesting, especially for my students to read. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so yeah, and I have two questions. One is basically when you talk about these kings claiming the lineage from gods. I'm assuming not from goddesses, but if it is from gods, in Europe there is this divine right of the kings. So ever our temples at that point of time, or priests or religion for that matter, ever validate these sort of claims?
Yeah. I mean, the conception isn't the same as European kingship, but it's very similar, because I actually talk about how the Chalukyas, for example, present their right to rule. They're like, we got the Bo standard from the divine Narayana himself. We are the favored of Skanda, the son of Shiva, the war god. And they even say we were nourished by the milk of the 7 mothers, the Saptamatrakas, right? So claiming this close association with the gods and reinforcing that, reiterating that by building temples and making these grants and worshipping the gods publicly was a way to show that you are divine. You are related to the divine. You are favored by the divine, and therefore you can't question your decisions because you are guided by the divine cosmic plan.
Yeah, so it's almost
a good person to read on this is Arjun Appadurai. He's done a book on temples and kingship, where he basically says the god is treated as the king in the temple and the king is treated as the god outside the temple.
Okay.
And there is a kind of play between the two. The god goes on his processions, the king has his processions, and so on. The ritual around kingship and gods is actually quite similar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
The
you
king
so
has his abhishekam before his enthronement and so on.
So So I have another question, which
We
is
may have to be a bit more democratic.
okay,
We can
sure,
speak after.
sure.
We can
Others,
speak
I'm
after.
afraid.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry. And then one more person at the back.
Thank you so much. Both of you have been writing great history and what I call accessible history. I'm a professor at a university, and I have many colleagues teaching history. And I studied history many decades ago. The way history is still taught in universities, like my colleagues teach, their reading lists are so obscure. Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press and Routledge and Sage and those kind of weighty publishers. And that puts these 18, 20-year-olds off history for life. It put me off history for life until guys like you brought me back into it. So if history told in narrative style that like you do or Manu do or Anirudh or William Dalrymple or historical fiction like Amitav Ghosh or Hilary Mantel, why are our academics so resistant to let books like yours get into universities? And what can young historians like you save our 18-year-olds from those books where half the book is notes, and references, and that puts our students to sleep. I have seen them going to sleep. Why can't narrative history like yours and William Dalrymple's and Amitava Ghosh get into university? Can you get them into universities, please?
Okay.
Quickly to the back. We're running out of time. Quickly.
So I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of academics in the audience who I might want to work with in the future, or who may be watching the session. So I'm not sure exactly what I should say, but what I can say is that I think narrative history is very important. Talking about history as a story of human beings just like you and me, who are living in times that may be different but still governed by the same fundamental human impulses, is really what gets young people excited about it. You know, I feel like very often we do history an injustice by reducing it to just rulers and a succession of dates and events, but showing how these relate to more fundamental dynamics that shape their world today. And of course, making footnotes interesting, which is something I try to do. In fact, I put a lot of jokes and like reference to Lord of the Rings and all these other things in my footnotes until my editor made me take them out. I think that, like, you know, making footnotes interesting, showing that historiography is not some dry and boring thing, but detective work that can reel in the reader and help them understand that history is not an individual or an academic doing it. It's a society at large trying to grapple with how it thinks about its past. Getting students to think about history in that way, rather than a succession of facts to be mugged up, I think is a far more productive approach.
Last question from there.
So whenever we are talking about successions probably in the public side, it just goes the eldest son becomes the next king. But you said that there's some courtly intrigues, the religious sects get involved, the queens get involved. So could you just elucidate on that factor? How does the succession take place in the Deccan kings?
Yeah, so it's very rarely simply the eldest son who gets selected. Very often it tends to be the case because the eldest son tends to be the son of the senior queen, and the senior queen herself comes from a very powerful royal lineage with their own resources. So making sure that he succeeds to the throne becomes a way of kind of fostering and nurturing this kind of connection between both dynasties. But in some cases, let's say that the eldest son is simply not competent, or let's say that the senior queen falls out of favor, then the succession would be opened up. And very often, if you had younger sons who were more militarily capable than their elder brother, they would be selected as the heir, or they would take the kingdom by force. And I talk about this in a lot of detail in the book. And I wish I could get into this in more detail, but I think we're already over time. But we can
hard
speak
and fast rule, frankly, on succession. Krishnadevaraya was the son of a junior wife. And some accounts actually say that she was a lamp maid, not even royal in terms of her background. You see this with the Rajputs. It's often younger sons who succeed, not the older ones. The older ones are sort of kicked out of the kingdom. There's no hard and fast rule. There are norms, but the norms are often flouted all the way down till the 19th century, even in the princely states, for example. Thank you again. Thank you, Anirudh.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
book. Do pick up a copy.
Thank you
Anirudh will be signing copies outside. And thank you for organizing this. And thank you, William and JLF.
Thank you, Anirudh Kanisetti and Manu S. Pillai. What a fabulous session this was. And we'd also like to thank the week for their support. Both of them will be signing their books. We've also got Mr. R. Rajmohan from the week here to present books to our authors.